I'll never forget the evening the cul-de-sac turned into a stage, sirens painting our block in red and blue while a woman with a clipboard tried to direct the world like it worked for her. My name is Isaiah Grant, and the woman in the uniform standing at our front door, boots dusty from the tarmac and eyes rimmed with travel. Is my wife Major Naomi Grant? Military police? Just back from 18 months overseas and 15 hours of flights that stitched her across time zones until her body forgot the shape of sleep. She texted me from base to say she'd beaten her schedule and would reach home before I could fight through I-75. So I drove with one hand on the wheel and one on my heartbeat and promised dinner, shower, silence, whatever her bones asked for first. Instead, she stepped into Meadowview Heights and met Patricia Garrison, our HOA president and part-time civic siren, pruning roses with the concentration of a judge and the compassion of a parking ticket. Patricia saw Naomi's fatigues, scanned the neighborhood like a security cam with a grudge, and decided a crime had arrived in daylight. By the time I skidded into our drive, Patricia was on the phone, pacing, voice sharp enough to slice a flag in half, telling dispatch there was an imposter on our porch, threatening the peace of a family community, pointing at my wife as if a badge could be erased by a finger. Naomi stood still. Not because she was afraid, but because she understood how fear looks for excuses. One hand visible on the strap of her ruck, the other holding the keys I'd given her when we bought this place 6 months into her deployment. Back when the website made the street look like the promise of normal. The first cruiser arrived with lights soft but present, then a second, and suddenly our block had an audience. Porch lights blinked on, curtains twitched, a dog barked, a toddler cried, and the air hummed with the thrill of other people's business. I jumped out of my car and the younger officer lifted a palm toward me, not hostile, just careful, like he was carrying a glass of water to a moving table. "Sir, give me a second," he said, and his tone carried something human, so I gave him 3. Patricia found the gap and sprinted into it with words, telling him she'd caught a trespasser impersonating the military, telling the older officer that you can't be too careful, telling the neighbors with her volume that this was heroism. I said calmly, "This is my wife. This is our home. She just got back from deployment." And the second those syllables arranged themselves into a picture, the older officer, gray at the temples, eyes like someone who's seen both lies and duty, stepped closer to Naomi and asked for identification. Naomi moved slow because training is a muscle, and she never puts anyone in a position where their nerves make the decision. She produced her military ID and then, from a separate wallet, her gold MP badge, the medal catching the sun and throwing it back across the lawn like proof. I watched the older officer's posture change at the hinge, skepticism folding into respect as neatly as a field cot. He checked the hologram, matched the information to his screen, keyed a call-out he knew would return quickly. And when confirmation arrived, Major Naomi Grant, active duty, exemplary record. He exhaled something soft enough that only the professional in him heard it. He handed back her credentials, then turned to Patricia and asked the first real question of the night. "Ma'am, exactly what made you believe this was a crime?" Patricia blinked like the light had changed too fast. She said she was protecting the neighborhood, that strangers in uniform could be anyone these days, that we have standards. Here. And each phrase lined up in the air like a fence with just enough gap for the rest of us to see through. The younger officer took notes, while the older one asked if she'd tried speaking to the resident, if she knew our names, if she'd verified anything before calling 911. Her answers shrank with every follow-up, words tripping over each other until the sentence, "I was just trying to keep things safe," fell out like a broken umbrella. Behind us, the cul-de-sac murmured into a different wind. The Johnsons mentioned the time Patricia called the police on their teen for skateboarding on his own driveway. Mrs. Chen, 20 years on this block and nostalgia-proof, said loud enough for the hedges to hear that Patricia had welcomed newcomers with fines for years. A couple from 2 streets over admitted she'd warned them their shutter beige was non-compliant by 2 shades and threatened liens if they didn't repaint by Sunday. The younger officer kept writing, the older one gently unspooling a pattern that had been hiding under manicured grass. Then Naomi spoke, calm even, a tone she'd used with tired soldiers and tense checkpoints, and the kind of danger that doesn't apologize afterward. She said she'd spent 18 months standing between people and harm, that she'd come home to take a shower, sleep, and hear the sound of our fridge again, that she was willing to answer any lawful questions, but not willing to be treated as an intruder in her own life. She did not raise her voice because she didn't need to. The silence that followed was the kind that tells you truth just landed. The older officer explained, for the record and the crowd, that filing false reports is a crime, that emergency lines exist for emergencies, and that harassment of returning service members is more than a misunderstanding. It's disrespect dressed like vigilance. Patricia's jaw tensed. Her eyes flicked. She tried to pivot into martyrdom, but the street had stopped dancing to her gavel. The officers took statements, noted dates, collected stories like seeds that would become evidence. A neighbor, Robert Waverly, the board's vice president, whose lawn has never known a weed, arrived with a folder under his arm and a decision in his eyes. And by dusk, he'd sent a message to the community list, emergency HOA meeting at 8. Naomi and I finally crossed our own threshold at 7:30, and I swear the house held its breath like it had been waiting to exhale since the moving truck left. She sat on the bench by the entryway and unlaced her boots with the concentration of a person trying not to fall asleep mid-task. I brought her water, then tea when she didn't want water, then laughter, because there is a point where the only thing you can build with is the absurd. She showered, steam fogging the mirror while the cul-de-sac outside learned how to whisper differently. At 7:58, we walked to the community center hand in hand, not because we wanted a show, but because you don't duck your own life. The room was already full, standing room only, voices edges off, cameras from local news waiting at the back because someone had posted a clip, and hashtags do their own kind of organizing. Patricia sat at the center of the board table, not quite centered in herself, gavel resting under her palm like a pet she suddenly couldn't control. Robert stood and called the meeting to order, his voice measured and firm, and began by summarizing the events. Call to 911, arrival of officers, verification of Naomi's identity, multiple neighbor accounts of prior harassment. Patricia interrupted to say this was trial by mob, but the room wasn't a mob. It was a ledger opening. People who had never spoken at meetings spoke now. A nurse fined for a wreath, out of season. A teacher cited because her trash cans were visible for 30 minutes after pickup. A young couple scolded for non-conforming cultural decorations when their Diwali lanterns glowed softly on their porch. Naomi sat beside me, spine straight, eyes steady, and the weight of the last year and a half sat with us, the room filling with small wrongs that suddenly recognized each other as a larger thing. Robert produced board emails, subject lines like tighten standards and set examples, and a spreadsheet that didn't match the last published budget. He said quietly that he'd requested an independent review 2 months ago and been ignored. He recommended a vote to suspend enforcement actions pending audit and to remove the current president for cause. Patricia tried to wield standards like a shield again, said the neighborhood would slide if certain people didn't learn how to live among established residents, and the line hung in the air until everyone could hear the words she hadn't said. The vote rose like a tide. Hands went up row by row, including 2 board members who had never crossed her, and the gavel left her hand, not dramatically, just definitively. For the first time in years, Patricia looked small, not because she had shrunk, but because the frame she'd used to look big had been taken away. A police liaison entered then, the younger officer from earlier, to confirm for the room that the report had been filed as a misuse of emergency services and that multiple resident statements were on record. In the corner, a reporter murmured into a camera the sentence that would run at 10. HOA president faces removal after calling police on returning black service member, verified by badge and ID on scene. The interim board scheduled an audit, paused fines, and opened the floor to questions that sounded more like exhalations. When it ended, neighbors we barely knew pressed our hands, apologized, offered food, offered yard work, offered babysitting for a child we don't have, people searching for a currency for remorse. Naomi thanked them with the same grace she brings to everything, and then finally we went home. The house felt warmer, or maybe it was just ours again. She sat at the kitchen counter, hair damp in an old Academy t-shirt, and stared at the steam coming off a bowl of soup, like it might tell her we were done. "You good?" I asked. "I'm home," she said, which is the same thing. We slept a kind of sleep that has footsteps in it, the "we made it" sleep, and woke to a neighborhood that had traded whispers for decisions. By noon, the interim board emailed a notice. Independent auditors engaged. Enforcement frozen. Special session in 72 hours to consider bylaw revisions defining harassment and establishing due process. It was the kind of email neighborhoods send when they realize inertia is not neutrality. 2 days later, a county investigator came by with the right to serve liaison from the Veterans Office. They interviewed Naomi on the porch with care that looked like professionalism and felt like respect. They asked about the approach, the words, the timeline, the potential chilling effect on veterans moving into the community. Naomi answered plain and precise, every answer a brick in a road she didn't choose to build but would make sure others could walk. Neighbors kept stopping by, some to say sorry, some to bring pie, one to say his father had been military police and that seeing her badge made him want to stand a little straighter. The news segment that night showed exactly what happened. Patricia pointing, Naomi standing, badge reflecting sunlight, officers listening and then redirecting. The anchor called it a lesson in assumptions, which is tidy television. I call it Tuesday in America. The audit landed in 3 weeks with the weight of an anvil, line items that didn't line up, fines collected outside bylaw authority, consultations coded as community improvements that looked a whole lot like personal legal bills. Patricia's signature appeared where it shouldn't and disappeared where it should. The board's counsel briefed the membership with a careful throat and the phrase, "breach of fiduciary duty," and the room exhaled into a sound that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite relief. Naomi squeezed my hand under the folding table, and I realized I had been balling mine into a fist without noticing. The board voted to refer findings to the DA and to pursue restitution. Patricia, who had sat through it with lips pressed into a thin defense, broke into appeals, but the story she used to narrate the neighborhood had lost its microphone. Later that night, the street felt quiet in a new way, the kind of quiet that means work got done. Naomi and I walked the block with 2 mugs of tea. Porch lights blinked like small apologies. The sky felt wider. And for the first time since we unpacked boxes, Meadowview Heights looked like a place that might live up to its name if the people inside it did. The next morning, a certified envelope arrived for Patricia. I didn't see her sign, but the courier said he'd never watched a signature tremble. A week later, a separate letter came addressed to members. Emergency vote to permanently ban 911 calls for enforcement of non-criminal HOA issues. Required de-escalation training for board members, and a standing liaison seat for a veteran or first responder. It passed with numbers that looked like unanimity except for one abstention. Naomi pinned the notice to our fridge like a medal she didn't ask for. And that's when the district attorney filed charges. Embezzlement by conversion for the misused fines, false report to emergency services, and a count of harassment under the state's enhanced protections for service members. The court dates spun up in the calendar, the cameras came back, and I realized our porch had become a backdrop for a lesson. Naomi refused interviews. She said the story wasn't about her. It was about a neighborhood deciding whether rules protect or punish. I believed her because she always tells me the hard version first. On the day of the plea, we sat 2 benches back. Patricia's lawyer argued for leniency, called it overzealous stewardship, blamed confusion in the bylaws. The judge listened like a stone listens to rain. Weather is not an argument. When it was Naomi's turn, she stood, the room catching its breath, and said only this: "I serve because home should mean safe. I came home to a call that said I was dangerous. I want no one else to learn their neighbors by way of sirens." The judge nodded like that sentence had mass. Sentencing landed between mercy and memory. Restitution of every misused dollar plus penalties. 18 months probation with community service at the County Veterans Center and the Community Garden. A ban from holding any HOA office for 10 years. a formal written apology to be entered into the HOA records and read aloud at the next meeting. Some said it wasn't enough. Some said it was too much. I say it was a start. The following month, the air in Meadowview Heights felt different, lighter, like the place itself had exhaled. The HOA meeting where Patricia was required to read her apology filled the community center to bursting. Naomi and I sat near the back, same seats as before, but this time there were thank you nods instead of side eyes when we walked in. Patricia stepped up to the microphone wearing beige instead of authority. Her hands shook just enough to make the paper tremble while she read, "I extend my sincere apology to Major Naomi Grant and Mr. Isaiah Grant for my actions that led to the misuse of emergency services and for the distress I caused. My behavior did not represent the values of this community." The words were small, but they were on record, inked into minutes she could never rewrite. The room stayed silent until Naomi stood, nodded once, and said, "Apology accepted. Let's build something better." That line landed like new foundation. Afterward, the new board rolled out the reforms, mandatory anti-bias and de-escalation training for all officers, a clear appeal process for violations, quarterly public audits, and a rule that HOA complaints could no longer bypass mediation for police intervention. They even created a community inclusion council with one seat reserved for a veteran or first responder. Naomi declined but suggested a young medic who'd just moved in. People clapped. It wasn't loud, just steady. The story reached beyond our block. A local paper ran a feature called When Neighbors Learn, turning our cul-de-sac into shorthand for accountability. For once, the cameras didn't come for chaos. They came to show correction. Patricia kept to herself after that. She served her community hours at the Veterans Center and the garden. Naomi saw her once, kneeling by the tomatoes, silent, working the soil. Maybe remorse looks like weeding. The HOA meetings grew shorter. The agendas talked about real repairs instead of imagined threats. The new board president, Robert Waverly, started every session by reading the first line of the new charter aloud. "Community begins with respect." By spring, the lawns still matched, but the people finally started speaking to each other. One evening, a boy rode his skateboard down the same driveway that once earned a 911 call, and no one complained. Instead, someone cheered. Naomi and I hosted a barbecue on Memorial Day, our first real gathering, and neighbors brought more food than our grill could hold. Under the glow of porch lights and fireflies, conversations drifted toward gardens, schools, and travel instead of rules. Halfway through the night, Robert tapped a glass and said quietly that change starts when someone refuses to shrink, then pointed toward Naomi. She shook her head, smiling, but everyone raised their cups anyway. Later, after the laughter thinned and the smoke curled away, we walked our usual loop past the rows of identical mailboxes, now less anonymous. The protected veterans' welcome sign the board had approved stood at the entrance. A small thing, but it caught the headlights just right. Naomi slipped her hand into mine and said, "You think they'll remember?" I said, "They already changed. That's memory enough." Back home, the living room smelled like charcoal and coleslaw. She took off the bracelet she'd worn since deployment, placed it on the mantel, and said, "Feels good to be part of something that's still learning." Outside, the night settled clean and wide. No sirens, no whispers, just the hum of sprinklers across even lawns watered by a shared quiet. Moral. Power built on fear collapses under truth, but communities built on apology can grow again, even where the grass once hid its roots.